This is the Abduäl transmitting from Denver Heights, San Antonio, and I want to thank you for tuning in, and dropping out into these digital airwaves. I am your highly humble host, Jamal Abduäl Brown. The Abduäl is a raw, spiritually serious, transgressive voice that reveals the power of the divine in the gutter, stands with the stigmatized, exposes false holiness, and calls people from shame, collapse, and self-deception into truth, dignity, and reconstruction. Self-deception is soul rot. James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." That line belongs at the door of this sermon like a prophet with a knife, because most people do not collapse all at once. Most people decay by refusal, by evasion, by a slow and practice turning away from what they already know. That is what self-deception is. It is not mere confusion. It is not innocence. It is not simply being wrong. Self-deception is when a person begins protecting the lie that protects them from the truth. It is when distortion stops being accidental and becomes inhabited. It is when a soul finds a false story easier to live inside the reality, and then starts calling that false story wisdom, identity, healing, discernment, complexity, trauma, growth, whatever name makes it easier to keep breathing in a crooked room. And that is why I call it soul rot. Not just sickness, not just error, rot, because rot is corruption that has settled in. Rot is decay with resonance. Rot is what happens when something spoiled is not cut out, but covered over. Rot is not always loud. It is often hidden, damp, patient, and intimate. It gets into the being, into the wound, into the place nobody wants open, because opening it would mean admitting the thing is worse than we said. That is what lying to yourself does. At first, it doesn't look dramatic. At first, it can even look functional. You can still smile while writing, still preach while writing, still post while writing, still use beautiful language while writing, still call yourself reflective, aware, conscious, evolving, healing, complicated, tender, guarded, selective, led, spiritual. That is what makes it so dangerous. If corruption always looked monstrous, most people would run from it. But inner corruption often arrives well-dressed. It comes with vocabulary. It comes with explanation. It comes with context. It comes with pain. And pain makes people hesitant to question it. So now a person can hide from the truth in plain sight. They call cowardice discernment. They call vanity self-respect. They call contempt standards. They call manipulation honesty. They call emotional control wisdom. They call possessiveness love. They call appetite authenticity. They call refusal to change accepting myself. They call numbness peace. They call avoidance healing. And every time they rename the thing instead of confronting it, the rot deepens, because the soul has a knowing in it. That is one of the hardest truths a person can hear. Deep under the performance, the spin, the narrative, the explanation, the self-protection, the soul knows. It knows when you're twisting the story to spare your ego. It knows when your confusion is really desire buying time. It knows when your tears are real but still functioning as cover. It knows when your silence is not peace but fear. It knows when your intensity is not passion but hunger. It knows when you're not being misunderstood, you're being exposed. And because the soul knows, self-deception requires maintenance. That is the exhausting part. A person cannot simply lie to themselves once. They have to keep defending the lie, keep feeding it, keep building explanations around it, keep recruiting language to protect it, keep finding people who will not threaten it. Keep avoiding silence long enough not to hear what rises in it. Keep turning accountability into violence and truth into cruelty and naming it judgment. That is why some people are always tired in the same way. Not tired from labor, tired from maintaining a false self. It is expensive to keep your conscience drugged. It is expensive to keep reality at a distance. It is expensive to need innocence more than truth. And if a person does it long enough, something inside them begins to change shape. Conscience softens in the wrong direction. The inner alarm goes quiet. What once felt unbearable starts feeling normal. The lie becomes familiar. The distortion becomes intimate. The false self becomes home. That is when rot becomes especially dangerous, when it no longer feels foreign. When what should disgust you begins to comfort you. When what should grieve you becomes your identity. When corruption stops feeling like a trespass and starts feeling like a personality. Then a person says things like, this is just who I am. This is just how I love. This is just how I survive. This is just my trauma. This is just my attachment style. This is just my intensity. This is just me protecting my peace. And maybe some of that is partly true. But partial truth is often where self-deception builds its cathedral. Because yes, trauma is real. Fear is real. Wounding is real. Adaptation is real. But pain explains a lot of things that does not sanctify. That needs to be said clearly. Pain explains distortion. It does not make distortion holy. Fear explains manipulation. It does not make manipulation righteous. Wounding explains control. It does not make control love. Trauma explains avoidance. It does not make avoidance wisdom. And this is the place where people get angry because they want explanation to function as absolution. They want, if I can explain it, I can keep it. If I can name the origin, I no longer have to confront the behavior. If I can tell you why I became this way, I no longer have to answer for how I am living now. But explanation is not repentance. Insight is not surrender. Self-awareness is not transformation. Vocabulary is not freedom. You can understand yourself brilliantly and still be full of shit. In fact, some of the most self-narrated people are the hardest to free because they are so good at explaining the prison, they have never had to admit they love certain parts of it. That's another hard truth. People are often attached to the very distortions they claim they want delivered from, because the lie is not just painful, it is useful. It protects image, it protects appetite, it protects innocence, it protects control, it protects fantasy, it protects the self from the humiliation of being fully seen. And many people would rather remain half alive in distortion than suffer the death of a persona they built to survive. That is why truth can feel violent. Not because truth is cruelty, because truth is demolition. Truth exposes the architecture of the false self. Truth names the appetite underneath the poetry. Truth shows where the noble language was hiding a petty motive. Truth peels the spiritual labels off the human fear. Truth strips away the incense and reveals the infection. Of course people resist it. People do not only resist truth because truth hurts, they resist truth because truth threatens the system they built to avoid hurt. And once that system has been lived in long enough, it becomes sacred to them. Now we're in truly dangerous territory. Because once your lie becomes sacred, you start defending it with religious intensity. Now everybody who questions it feels like an enemy. Now anybody who names it sounds abusive. Now every interruption of your self-story feels like violence. Now correction feels like betrayal. Now clarity feels like shaming. Now accountability feels unsafe. And if the lie gets spiritual enough, you can even bring God into the fraud. You can say, I'm being led. I have peace about it. This is what grace looks like for me. God knows my heart. I'm in a season. I'm protecting what's sacred. And maybe sometimes those things are true, but they are also some of the cleanest hiding places a dishonest soul can rent. I say that carefully. I say that as somebody who knows the taste of that kind of hiding. There were seasons in my own life where I did not call fear by its proper name. I call it discernment. I call it patience. I call it depth. I call it waiting on clarity. But if I stripped the language down to the bone, a lot of it was this. I did not want to face what was true, because facing what was true would have forced me to lose a certain image of myself. It would have forced me to admit that I was not only wounded, I was invested in being seen in a certain way, invested in preserving certain fantasies, invested in seeing me deep instead of being honest, invested in sounding morally awake while parts of me were still dodging the blade. That is humiliating to admit. But humiliation is not always your enemy. Sometimes humiliation is just the collapse of pretense. Sometimes it is mercy and no longer being allowed to call the poison medicine. Sometimes it is a blessed moment when the self you curated begins to die, and for one terrible second you think you're dying too, until you realize it was the false one choking. I know what it is to narrate myself beautifully and remain inwardly divided. I know what it is to sound deeper than I was disciplined. I know what it is to use language to dignify my own confusion. I know what it is to tell a story in a way that preserved my innocence while quietly deleting my appetite, my vanity, my fear, my evasion from the record. And I know what it cost. It made me harder to love cleanly. It made me hard to correct. It made me less available. It made me need too much from people. Not just love, but validation, mirroring, cover, distance, room to remain undefined. It made my inner world crowded with explanation and starved of truth. Nothing really shifted until I stopped trying to eloquate about myself and said uglier things more plainly. I lied. I hid. I stalled. I performed. I let complexity become camouflage. I let my wounds become an alibi for ways of being that were also about pride and appetite and fear. That confession did not feel freeing at first. It felt like being dragged into clean air after learning to breathe mold. That is how truth often feels to a soul acclimated to rot. It burns, but it burns because it's oxygen. And this is why I do not believe the deepest danger is ignorance. Ignorance can be interpreted. The deeper danger is self-deception, because self-deception recruits the intelligence, the vocabulary, the pain, the history, the spirituality, the entire personality into protecting the thing that needs to be broken. Self-deception is not mere blindness. It is blindness with a publicist. It is a soul issuing statements to protect its own corruption. That is why a self-deceived person can sound so convincing. They are often not lying only to you. They are lying through an eternally organized system that has had years to rehearse. And if you want to know whether self-deception is at work, watch what happens when truth gets close. Watch the panic. Watch the deflection. Watch the sudden flood of nuance. Watch the context multiply. Watch the wound come out of cue. Watch the motive stay conveniently unexplained. Watch how quickly the person becomes the victim of being named. Again, I'm not mocking real pain. I'm saying pain is one of the most common places people hide what they do not want morally confronted. Because a pain can become a shield, the lie will gladly wear it. And once the lie is wearing pain, everybody gets nervous about touching it. That's how rot survives community. People confuse compassion with cowardice. They confuse gentleness with vagueness. They confuse empathy with collusion. They confuse understanding with surrender. The real compassion does not help you misname the thing that is killing you. Real compassion does not stroke infection and call it mercy. Real compassion loves you enough to be truthful about your distortion. Real compassion is willing to be misunderstood if misunderstanding is the price of refusing to lie with you. That applies inwardly too. A person cannot heal while treating themselves with a false compassion that never requires contact with reality. Some people are very kind to their dysfunction and very cruel to the truth. They make room for every excuse. They light candles around every pattern. They create gorgeous language for every repetition. They hold themselves with endless tenderness, but never with honesty. That is not mercy. That is indulgence with a holy constant. Mercy and truth are not enemies. The divine does not have to choose between seeing clearly or loving deeply. Only fragile people think those are opposites. God sees the thing as it is. God sees the wound. God sees the adaptation. God sees the child who learned to survive. God sees the hunger. God sees the fear. God sees the self-protection. God sees the lie. All of it. And still the divine does not move away. That is mercy. But mercy does not mean agreement with your distortion. Mercy is not God helping you decorate the cage. Mercy is not the blessing of your false self. Mercy is God coming close enough to tear the lie open before it califies into destiny. Because if you keep lying to yourself long enough, eventually the lie shapes your loves. That may be the deepest danger of all. Self-deception is not just false thinking. It is disordered love. You begin loving image over integrity, comfort over truth, fantasy over surrender, control over vulnerability, innocence over honesty, explanation over repentance, familiar misery over costly freedom, and we become what we love. So if you love the lie more than the truth, you will slowly take the shape of the lie. Your love will bend crooked. Your instincts will become unreliable. Your tenderness will be contaminated by need. Your relationships will become places where the lie looks for cover, supply, or worship. Even your goodness will start serving the fraud. That is why some people cannot love without using, cannot confess without curating, cannot apologize without narrating, cannot receive correction without dissolving into either rage or collapse. Their whole interior system has been organized around self-protection, and self-protection, if enthroned long enough, becomes a false god. Then the person no longer asks what is true. They ask, what protects the self I need to preserve? That question will ruin a life. Because if protection becomes your highest value, you will eventually betray everything sacred to keep from being exposed. You will betray intimacy. You will betray honesty. You will betray your own conscience. You will betray the people who love you. You will even betray your own hunger for God if God begins speaking in a voice that threatens the persona. This is why some people become unreachable while still sounding spiritual. They're not unreachable because they are mysterious. They are unreachable because they are defended. And a defended soul always feels lonely in the end because no one can love you where you are absent. If the self you present is heavily managed, then every form of love that reaches you will partly miss you. You will stay hungry and call it bad luck. You will stay unseen and call it complexity. You will stay divided and call it depth. But it is very hard to be loved where you refuse to be true. That is why self-deception corrodes intimacy. It also corrodes prayer, because prayer requires some kind of realness, not eloquence, not polish, not the correct theological mode, realness. A person can say beautiful things to God and still remain profoundly hidden, can still use prayer as theater, can still confess in ways that reveal almost nothing, can still cry sincerely and remain evasive, can still perform brokenness while protecting the one lie they do not intend to surrender. And if that becomes a habit, even spirituality becomes part of the masking system. That is dark, but it's common. And this is why I say self-deception is not just a mistake, it is a moral and spiritual emergency. Because what is at stake is not merely factual accuracy about yourself. What is at stake is your capacity for contact with truth, contact with love, contact with conscience, contact with God, contact with other human beings as they are and as you are. Self-deception severs contact with while giving the appearance of interior life. It lets a person remain expressive without being honest, reflective without being surrendered, emotionally articulate without being morally awake. And this age rewards that. This age loves the appearance of depth, loves analysis, loves trauma literacy, loves language, loves self-disclosure in curated doses, loves emotional sophistication. But all of that can exist right beside a will that has never once truly bowed to what is true. That is why so many people look illuminated and still remain unfree. The prison got prettier. That's all. And if you hear this as condemnation without hope, you are hearing me wrong. Hope is exactly why this word must be spoken so hard. If I believe people could not change, I would not bother with the blade of mercy. Incisions in mercy. Naming is mercy. Exposure is mercy. The collapse of the false self, terrible as it feels, is mercy, because what falls apart under the truth was never stable enough to save you. And better to lose the false life than preserve it so long it devours the real one. So what is the way out? Not self-hatred. Self-hatred is often just vanity and ashes. It still keeps the self at the center. It can still be dramatic, self-absorbed, and strangely protective of the same false identity. No, the way out is sterner and cleaner than that. Truth. Truth without cosmetics. Truth without PR. Truth without selecting only the flattering part. Truth without turning your history into a loophole. Truth without making your explanation the hero. You tell it plain. I lied. I wanted that. I hid behind that. I manipulated there. I called it one thing, but it was another. I was wounded, yes. And I was also proud. I was afraid, yes. And I was also feeding something. I was hurt, yes. I also used the hurt to avoid surrender. That kind of truth is not neat. It is not brand safe. It is not elegant. It does not preserve your innocence. Good. Innocence was not going to save you anyway. Truth may humiliate you, but humiliation is often the threshold of integrity. Then after truth, repentance, not performance, not mood, not endless self-analysis, repentance, a turn, a renouncing, a refusal to keep making a home inside what is false. It may require apology. It may require loss. It may require being seen differently. It may require grief. It may require that certain stories about yourself do not survive. Let them die. Some stories deserve burial. And after repentance comes a slower work, rebuilding a self that is less defended, more honest, and more governable by truth and appetite. That takes time, but it cannot begin while the lie is still being fed. So let me say this as plainly as I know how. Stop protecting what is poisoning you. Stop making a shrine out of your distortion. Stop calling the cage a sanctuary. Stop calling your evasions complexity. Stop asking people to honor what you have not been willing to confront. Stop begging the divine to bless the architecture of your avoidance. Come into the light in the ugliest way you know how. Not polished, not explained, not beautifully contextualized, just true. Because the soul begins to breathe again where it stops defending its own infection. And if this word feels harsh, maybe harsh is merciful right now. Maybe what you have called compassion has only kept you padded from the truth. Maybe what you needed was not one more tender explanation, but one clean sentence that broke the spell. So let me end there. James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Yes, face it then. Face the lie. Face the appetite. Face the vanity. Face the fear. Face the self that learned to survive by distortion and then mistake distortion for identity. Face a part of you that still wants to be preserved more than purified. Face it, because the worst thing about soul rot is not only that it kills, it is that it teaches you to call the stink your own skin. It teaches you to mistake the cage for home. It teaches you to experience clean air as an insult. Don't get that dead. Don't get that numb. Don't get so intimate with what is false that truth sounds violent and freedom sounds strange. Turn the blade around. Cut out what is false and let truth make a wound clean enough for God to heal. I am Jamal Abduäl Brown. This is the Abduäl. Let it be so.